There's something that feels almost confusing about the way this works. Because everything you've been taught about communication and relationships tells you that more is better, more expression, more reassurance, more explaining, more effort. You're told that if you just say the right things, if you just open up enough, if you just prove how much you care, the other person will finally meet you there. But when it comes to someone who leans avoidant, that approach doesn't just fail quietly, it actually pushes them further away in a way that feels deeply personal. And that's where the shift begins. Because what draws them in isn't intensity, it's something much more subtle, something that most people completely overlook. It's a communication style that doesn't try to control the connection, doesn't try to force closeness, doesn't try to rush emotional safety, and because of that, it creates something inside them they can't easily explain, but can't ignore either. What makes this even more powerful is that it's not about playing games, and it's not about pretending you don't care. It's about understanding something most people never realize, that avoidants don't respond to pressure the way others do. Pressure, even when it's disguised as love, feels overwhelming to them. It activates something inside them that tells them they're losing their space, losing their independence, losing control. And the moment that feeling kicks in, their instinct isn't to lean closer, it's to step back, emotionally and sometimes physically. But when your communication removes that pressure, when it replaces urgency with calm presence, something different happens. Instead of feeling like they need to escape, they start feeling safe enough to stay. And that safety, when it's paired with just the right amount of emotional depth, begins to pull them in a way that feels natural, almost involuntary. The truth is, most people unknowingly communicate in a way that creates tension for an avoidant. Over-explaining emotions, sending long messages trying to be understood, asking for clarity too soon, needing constant reassurance, all of it comes from a genuine place, but it lands differently on someone who processes connection through distance. It makes them feel like they're being pulled into something they're not ready for, something they can't fully manage. And even if they care, even if they feel something real, that pressure becomes louder than the connection itself. So they withdraw, not always because they want to lose you, but because they don't know how to stay without losing themselves. And that's the part that hurts the most, because from your side, it feels like you did everything right, you showed up, you expressed, you tried, but what actually works requires a completely different approach, one that doesn't try harder, but moves differently. That shift begins with how you carry yourself emotionally when you communicate. It's not about saying more, it's about saying less with more intention. It's about removing the urgency behind your words and replacing it with a grounded kind of presence. When you stop reacting immediately, when you stop feeling like every message needs to fix something or move the connection forward, your energy changes. And that change is something an avoidant notices almost instantly, even if they don't consciously understand it. Because instead of feeling like they're being pulled into emotional intensity, they feel like they're standing in front of something calm, something steady, something that doesn't demand from them, but still holds depth. And that combination, that's what starts to create curiosity. There's a quiet power in not reacting the moment something feels off. When they take longer to reply, when they become a little distant, when their energy shifts in a way that would normally trigger anxiety, your ability to stay grounded instead of chasing creates a completely different dynamic. Instead of feeding the cycle where one person pulls away and the other moves closer, you interrupt it. You give space without withdrawing your presence entirely. And in that space, something begins to happen inside them. They start to notice the absence of pressure. They start to feel the difference between what they expected and what you're actually giving. And that difference creates a kind of tension, not the overwhelming kind that pushes them away, but a subtle kind that draws them in. This is where silence becomes something powerful instead of something scary. Most people see silence as a sign that something is wrong, something that needs to be fixed immediately. But in this communication style, silence becomes a space where curiosity can grow. When you don't fill every gap with words, when you don't rush to explain or reassure, you leave room for them to think about you, to wonder what you're feeling, to notice your absence in a way that isn't forced but natural. And that wondering, that's where attachment starts to deepen for someone who usually avoids it. Because instead of being overwhelmed by too much emotional input, they're drawn in by what isn't being said. At the same time, it's not about becoming distant or cold, it's about being intentional with what you do express. When you speak, it carries weight. When you show interest, it feels genuine but not overwhelming. You're not overloading them with emotion, but you're not withholding yourself either. You're present in a way that feels balanced, in a way that doesn't try to take something from them, but simply exists. And that presence becomes something they start to feel comfortable around, something they don't feel the need to escape from. Over time, that comfort turns into something deeper, a kind of attachment that builds slowly but steadily without the usual resistance. Another shift happens in how you handle your own emotional state. Instead of looking to them to regulate how you feel, you become steady within yourself. Your mood isn't dictated by how quickly they respond or how available they are in a given moment, and this is something they pick up on, even without words. Because when your energy isn't fluctuating based on their behavior, it removes a layer of pressure they're used to feeling. They don't feel responsible for maintaining your emotional balance. They don't feel like they're constantly being measured or expected to show up in a certain way. And because of that, they start showing up more naturally, more willingly, without the same resistance that usually holds them back. There's also something deeply intriguing about not revealing everything at once. When you don't lay out all your thoughts, all your feelings, all your intentions immediately, you create a sense of depth that takes time to unfold. And for someone who is used to keeping emotional distance, that kind of slow discovery feels safer. It doesn't overwhelm them, but it keeps them engaged. They start to feel like there's more to you than what's immediately visible, more layers to understand, more to uncover. And that process, that gradual unfolding, keeps them invested in a way that intensity never could. At the core of all of this is emotional self-control, not in a way that suppresses what you feel, but in a way that allows you to choose how you express it. You're not reacting from fear. You're responding from clarity. You're not trying to hold on to them. You're allowing the connection to exist without forcing it. And that difference changes everything. Because instead of feeling like they're being pulled into something they might lose control of, they start to feel like they're stepping into something that gives them space to breathe. And within that space, their guard begins to lower, slowly, quietly, almost without them realizing it. And what's happening underneath all of this is something they don't expect. They start thinking about you more. They start noticing the way you communicate, the way you don't react like others did, the way you don't chase or demand or overwhelm. It creates a contrast that stands out in their mind. And that contrast turns into curiosity. Curiosity turns into attention, and attention over time turns into something much deeper. Something that feels close to obsession, not because you forced it, but because you allowed it to grow in a way that felt safe for them. And that's the part that begins to shift the dynamic in a way you can actually feel, even if nothing obvious has been said yet. Because now, instead of you wondering where you stand, something starts happening on their side that they're not used to dealing with. They begin to feel a subtle loss of control. Not in a dramatic or chaotic way, but in a quiet, internal way that keeps coming back to them when they least expect it. They notice that you're not reacting the way others did. You're not trying to pull them closer when they create distance. You're not filling every silence with reassurance or questions. And because of that, the usual patterns they rely on to keep emotional space stop working the same way. This is where something deeper begins to unfold. Because avoidants are used to understanding relationships through predictable reactions. When they pull back, the other person moves closer. When they go quiet, the other person tries harder. When they create distance, the connection either intensifies in pressure or slowly falls apart. But when you communicate in a way that doesn't follow that pattern, it creates something unfamiliar. And unfamiliar, when it feels safe instead of threatening, becomes incredibly hard to ignore. It makes them pause. It makes them think. It makes them come back to the interaction in their mind, trying to understand what's different about you and why it feels the way it does. And this is where your ability to not chase becomes one of the most powerful things you can embody. Because the moment you stop trying to close the gap they create, the gap starts to speak for itself. They feel it, not as pressure, but as absence, not as something forced, but as something real. And in that space, something starts to grow inside them, a quiet awareness that you're not waiting in the same way others did, that you're not holding on to them tightly, hoping they'll come back. And that awareness begins to trigger something they're not used to feeling, the possibility of losing you. But it's not the kind of fear that comes from intensity or emotional confrontation. It's much more subtle than that. It shows up in small moments, when they notice you didn't respond as quickly as before, when they realize you didn't react to their distance, when they feel a slight shift in your energy that suggests your world doesn't revolve around them, and instead of pushing them away, this kind of shift pulls them in. Because now, for the first time, they're not trying to manage your emotions, they're trying to understand their own. At the same time, the way you communicate continues to reinforce this shift without needing to say anything directly. You're still present, still engaged, but there's a lightness to it. You're not over-investing in every interaction, not trying to extract meaning from every message. You allow conversations to breathe. You allow moments to exist without turning them into something more than they are, and this creates a sense of ease that avoidants rarely experience in connection. Because instead of feeling like every interaction carries emotional weight they have to respond to, it feels simple, it feels natural, it feels like something they can step into without losing themselves. And that simplicity becomes addictive in a way they don't expect. Because most connections they've experienced either felt too distant to matter or too intense to handle. But this sits somewhere in between. It has depth, but it doesn't overwhelm. It has presence, but it doesn't demand. And because of that, they start to feel drawn to it in a way that doesn't trigger their usual defenses. They don't feel the need to pull away as quickly or as strongly. They start staying a little longer in conversations. They start initiating in small ways. They start showing up with a kind of consistency that feels new, even to them. What's really happening underneath all of this is that your communication style is allowing them to experience connection without pressure. And when pressure is removed, their natural curiosity begins to take over. They start paying attention to the details, the way you respond, the things you choose to say, the moments you choose not to say anything at all. They begin to notice the contrast between you and others they've known. And that contrast becomes something they can't easily replace. Because it's not just about what you do, it's about how you make them feel when they're around you. There's also something powerful in the way you don't overvalidate them. You acknowledge them, you appreciate them, but you don't place them on a pedestal. You don't make them the center of your emotional world, and that balance creates respect. It shows them that while you're open to connection, you're not dependent on it. And that independence becomes something they're drawn to because it removes the pressure they usually feel in relationships. It allows them to engage without feeling like they're being pulled into something they can't handle. And then there's the subtle pullback that happens without announcement, not as a tactic, not as a game, but as a natural response to your own emotional awareness. When something feels off, you don't chase clarity immediately, you take a step back. You give yourself space, and in doing so, you create a shift that they can feel. Because now, instead of them controlling the distance becomes shared. And that shared space creates a kind of tension they're not used to managing. It makes them wonder what changed. It makes them pay attention in a different way. This is where the dynamic begins to reverse in a quiet but powerful way. Instead of you trying to understand where they stand, they begin trying to understand where you stand. Instead of you waiting for their attention, they start noticing when it's not there. And this shift doesn't come from manipulation, it comes from alignment, from you no longer abandoning your own emotional stability to maintain the connection, from you communicating in a way that reflects self-respect, clarity, and calm presence. And as this continues, something deeper starts to build inside them. It's not immediate, and it's not always obvious, but it's consistent. They start thinking about you when you're not around. They replay conversations in their mind, not because they feel pressured, but because something about it felt different. They start to feel a sense of comfort in your presence, combined with a curiosity they can't fully explain. And that combination, comfort and curiosity, is what keeps them coming back. Because now the connection isn't something they're trying to avoid, it's something they're starting to lean toward, slowly, carefully, but willingly. And the more they experience this kind of communication, the more it reshapes how they feel about you. You're no longer just someone they connect with, you become someone they associate with ease, with safety, with a kind of emotional balance they didn't know they needed. And that's where it begins to turn into something that feels almost like obsession, not in a chaotic or overwhelming way, but in a quiet, persistent way that stays with them. They don't feel the need to escape it because it doesn't feel like pressure. They don't feel the need to control it because it doesn't feel unpredictable in a threatening way. Instead, it feels like something they want to understand more, something they want to be around more, something that keeps drawing their attention back even when they try to focus elsewhere. And all of this started with a simple shift, not in what you said, but in how you said it, in the energy behind your communication, in your ability to stay grounded, to allow space, to not force what isn't ready to unfold. And because of that, the connection was able to grow in a way that didn't trigger their defenses, but instead quietly moved past them. And as this quiet pull continues to build inside them, something even more complex begins to take shape, a kind of internal conflict they can't easily resolve. Because on one side, they feel drawn to you in a way that feels safe, steady, and almost grounding, but on the other side, there's still that part of them that's used to distance, used to control, used to keeping emotions at a level where they don't feel exposed. And the more they feel themselves leaning toward you, the more that conflict starts to surface, not in a way that pushes you away like before, but in a way that makes them think about you even more. They start questioning what this is, why it feels different, why you don't trigger the same reactions others did. And instead of finding clear answers, they find themselves circling back to you, to your words, your tone, your presence, the way you communicate without pressure but still hold depth. And that lack of clarity doesn't create distance, it creates focus. Because when something feels both safe and unfamiliar at the same time, the mind doesn't let it go easily. It keeps returning to it, trying to understand it, trying to feel it again. And this is where your consistency becomes everything. Not consistency in effort or intensity, but consistency in energy. You don't suddenly switch into overgiving or emotional urgency. You don't break the calm presence you've created just because you feel them getting closer. Instead, you stay grounded. You stay aligned with the same communication style that created the shift in the first place, and that stability becomes something they begin to rely on, even if they don't say it out loud. Because in a world where most connections feel unpredictable or overwhelming, your presence starts to feel like something solid, something they can return to without hesitation. At the same time, you continue to hold your sense of independence. You don't center your life around their attention. You don't wait for their messages to feel okay. You move through your life with a sense of completeness that doesn't depend on their presence. And that independence becomes one of the most attractive things about you, because it shows them that you're not trying to take something from them, you're simply choosing to share space with them. And that difference removes the pressure they're used to feeling, making it easier for them to stay, to engage, to invest in ways they normally wouldn't. As this continues, they start to notice something else. You're not trying to define the connection too quickly. You're not asking for labels, not pushing for clarity before it naturally forms. And that creates a sense of freedom within the connection. It allows things to unfold without feeling forced. And for someone who is used to pulling away when things feel too structured or too intense, that freedom becomes something they deeply appreciate. It allows them to explore their feelings without the fear of being locked into something they're not ready for. And because of that, their emotional walls begin to lower in ways that feel almost unintentional. They start sharing a little more, opening up in small, subtle ways, letting you see parts of them they usually keep guarded, not because you asked for it, but because they feel safe enough to offer it. And that's the difference that changes everything. Because when someone chooses to open up on their own, without pressure, without expectation, it creates a much deeper kind of connection. One that feels real, one that feels earned, one that feels like it belongs to both of you. There's also something powerful in the way you handle their moments of distance now, because those moments don't disappear completely. They still have times where they pull back, where they need space, where their old patterns try to resurface. But the difference is in how you respond. You don't panic, you don't chase, you don't try to pull them out of it. You allow it without losing yourself in the process. And that response does something important. It shows them that the connection isn't fragile, that it doesn't depend on constant closeness to exist. And that realization makes it easier for them to come back, because they don't feel like they're returning to something unstable or demanding. And each time they come back, the connection deepens a little more. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a steady, almost invisible way that builds over time. They begin to associate you with a sense of ease, with a kind of emotional safety they didn't know they were capable of experiencing. And that association becomes something they start to seek out, something they start to prioritize, even if they don't fully understand why. Eventually, this leads to a shift in how they see you. You're no longer just someone they're talking to, someone they're getting to know. You become something more significant in their mind, someone who feels different from anyone they've experienced before, someone who doesn't trigger their need to escape, but instead makes them feel comfortable staying, and that difference creates a kind of attachment that runs deeper than surface level attraction. It becomes something they think about when you're not around, something they miss in quiet moments, something they find themselves wanting to return to again and again. And this is where that feeling of obsession truly begins to take form, not as something overwhelming or chaotic, but as something steady and persistent. You stay in their thoughts, in their attention, in the background of their day, even when they're focused on other things. Because what you've created isn't just a connection, it's an experience of communication that felt easy, natural, and safe, but also intriguing enough to keep them engaged. They begin to notice that other interactions don't feel the same, that the ease they feel with you isn't something they can easily find elsewhere. And that realization makes your presence more valuable in their life, not because you demanded it, but because you allowed it to grow naturally. You gave it space to become something real, something meaningful, something that didn't rely on pressure or intensity to exist. And the most powerful part of all of this is how it changes you in the process. Because you're no longer communicating from a place of fear or uncertainty, you're no longer trying to secure the connection or prove your worth within it. You're simply showing up as someone who is grounded, self-aware, and emotionally steady. And that version of you doesn't just attract avoidance, it creates healthier, more balanced connections across the board. So what started as a simple shift in communication becomes something much deeper. It becomes a reflection of how you see yourself, how you hold your own emotional space, how you allow connections to form without forcing them. And in doing that, you create something that doesn't just draw people in, it makes them stay. Because at the end of the day, the communication style that makes an avoidant feel obsessed with you isn't about tricks or strategies. It's about energy. It's about presence. It's about being someone who doesn't try to control the connection, but instead allows it to unfold in a way that feels safe, balanced, and real. And when you communicate from that place, you become something they don't feel the need to escape from. You become something they don't want to lose. And even after all of this, there's one final layer that most people never fully see, because it doesn't show up on the surface right away. It builds quietly, over time, in the spaces between conversations, in the moments where nothing is happening, and yet everything is shifting underneath. Because what you've created through this way of communicating isn't just attraction, it's emotional imprinting. You become a reference point in their mind, not just for how connection feels, but for how safe connection can feel. And that's something they don't easily replace or forget. Because before this, their experience with closeness may have always carried a kind of tension, a sense that eventually something would become too much, too demanding, too overwhelming. But with you, that pattern didn't play out the same way. You didn't rush them, you didn't trap them in expectations, you didn't make them feel like they had to perform or prove something to keep the connection alive. And because of that, you become associated with relief, with ease, with a kind of emotional quiet that feels rare. And here's where it goes even deeper. They begin to realize slowly that the reason they feel this pull toward you isn't just because of how you treat them, it's because of who you are when you're not trying, when you're not chasing, when you're not over explaining, when you're not adjusting yourself just to maintain the connection. That version of you, the one that exists naturally without force, is the version that created all of this. And that realization does something powerful inside them. Because now it's no longer about the connection being easy or comfortable, it becomes meaningful. It becomes something they don't want to lose, not because they're afraid of being alone, but because they recognize that what they feel with you is different from what they've felt before. And that kind of recognition doesn't fade quickly. It stays with them, it lingers, it follows them into other moments, other conversations, other connections, and quietly reminds them that something about you stands out in a way they can't easily explain. And this is where your role becomes even more important. Not in what you do, but in what you don't do. You don't break your alignment just because they're getting closer. You don't suddenly become overly available just because they're showing more interest. You don't shift into old patterns out of fear of losing what's building, because the moment you abandon that grounded communication style, the moment you replace calm presence with urgency or need, the dynamic begins to change again. Not instantly, but subtly. And they feel it, even if they can't explain it. That's why staying consistent in your energy matters more than anything at this stage, because now it's not just about attracting them, it's about maintaining the environment that allowed them to open up in the first place. And when you do that, something even more powerful happens. They begin to invest, not always in obvious ways at first, but in small, meaningful shifts. They start reaching out more. They start checking in. They start making space for you in their life without feeling like they're being pushed into it. And the key difference here is that it's coming from them. Not because you asked, not because you needed it, not because you demanded clarity, but because they want to. And that want is everything. Because for someone who is used to protecting their independence, choosing connection willingly is a big shift. It means they're no longer just reacting to the dynamic, they're participating in it. They're allowing themselves to feel it, to explore it, to move toward it, instead of away from it. And as that continues, the emotional gap that once existed begins to close, not through force, but through repetition, through consistent experiences of safety, ease, and curiosity, through moments where they expected pressure, but found calm instead, where they expected intensity, but found balance instead. And over time, those experiences reshape how they relate to you. You're no longer someone they need to keep at a distance. You're someone they feel comfortable letting closer. And that shift, that movement from distance to closeness, is what creates the deepest level of attachment, because it wasn't rushed, it wasn't forced, it wasn't built on temporary emotions or surface level attraction. It was built on something much more stable, something that feels real. And that's why it lasts. Because what you created didn't just bypass their defenses, it changed how they experience connection itself. And here's the part that truly brings everything together. The moment you stop trying to be chosen is the moment you become unforgettable. Because when you're no longer communicating from a place of needing something from them, your presence becomes something they choose to return to. Again and again, not out of obligation, not out of pressure, but out of genuine desire. And that desire, that quiet, steady pull they feel toward you, is what turns into that sense of obsession. Not loud, not chaotic, not overwhelming, but constant. It shows up in the way they think about you when you're not around. in the way they notice your absence when you're quiet, in the way they compare other connections to the one they feel with you and find something missing. And the most powerful part of all of this is that you didn't create it by doing more. You created it by doing less, but doing it with intention, by choosing calm over urgency, by choosing presence over pressure, by choosing self-respect over emotional chasing. And in doing that, you didn't just change the way they see you, you changed the way they feel about connection itself. And that's something they don't walk away from easily.